So this morning we actually, I think, mixed up the verses last week, and we had the verses for this week up last week because I was studying ahead and got them mixed up. But anyway, if it looks familiar in the bulletin, same verses, but we haven't covered them yet. But anyway, here in Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, we're looking at, living for heaven, living for eternity, making sure that we're not living for the things of this world. And so here today, in verse 1 of chapter 3, it says this. It says, if then you have been raised with Christ. It says, seek the things that are above. And it says, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. And, he's talking about being raised from the dead. And throughout this whole book, Paul has made this point of that, we have literally, we're supposed to think of it as that we have died. Like the person that we were, the person that lived for this world, the person that lived in this world has died, and we've been raised again to live with Christ. Like our home is up there, and our life is up there, and we're supposed to be living for and seeking the things that are above. It says, if you've been raised with Christ, and I think sometimes we think, a metaphor, an exaggeration, like we haven't been raised to new life. We're still here, we're still the same person, but I think he really wants to get it through our head. We need to think of ourselves as a new person, as a different person that does not live for this world still. Like we need to get it through our head that we belong to Christ, and we've been raised to live with him and been in this new belonging that we live with him. And to just, how amazing is it to think that you belong to Jesus? Like you are his, and you've begun this new journey. So in verse 2 he says this. He says, set your minds on things that are above, and he says, not on things that are on the earth. And he says, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And again, he's saying this. He's saying that we need to think of ourselves as if the person we were has died. So all of the pursuits that we would have been pursuing, all of the things that, if you think of this world and you're like, what are all my favorite things? Whether it's, it could be, the Bears who may be leaving Illinois anyway, a little bit. We could still be a Bears fan, but it may be your job, your work. It may be, he's going to list a lot of things that are not great pursuits. He's going to list all of these things, but this is not our belonging anymore. Like we need to think of ourselves first and foremost, primarily as somebody who literally died to this earth, and we're living for something else. We belong to Jesus Christ. We belong to him. So he says this. He says, set your minds on things that are above and not on things that are on the earth. And some of you who are older and wiser and have lived longer than me probably, I would assume, would think the same thing. But just in my experience, I would think, is life not almost a series of disappointments in some sense? I mean, there is a lot of good things in life, but I was thinking, all the pursuits I've had in life, and I remember when I was younger, there was this bike I really wanted, this specialized bike. It was a flatland trick bike. I just wanted it. It was like $450, and I'm just this little kid, and I'm scrimping and saved all the way up for it, and I got it, and I didn't really have time to ride it. I mean, I rode it some, but it was just like, wow, it wasn't like this satisfying moment in my life, And then you want a house, and you get a house, and you realize, man, the taxes and the upkeep, this is eating me alive. This is it's almost like drowning to a certain extent. It is a lot of work. And then I wanted more land, so I bought more land, and I was like, there's a lot of weeds, and there's a lot more upkeep. It's a lot more work than it was before, And then, I wanted, animals, and we got pigs and chickens and turkeys and all these things, and it's a lot of feed, and it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of mess, and it's a lot of butchering, which is not a lot of fun. And there's a lot of, you're just like, you want these things, but in the end, they really begin to weigh on you. I wanted a boat. I think I've bought 4 boats in my life, which is kind of crazy. But you find out that they break down, and you have problems, and you have time, and you're like, I don't have time. I wanted this, but time is an issue. I got a job. I got a life. I got kids. You think of all these things, and you're like, man, they just don't always satisfy. I mean, I've had guns I've wanted. I was like, oh, I really want that gun. It sits in my safe, gathering dust for 5 years on end. And you're like, did it bring me all the joy in the world? Well, not really, Maybe a different one would. No. but you want a new car, and you get the new car you want, and then it gets a scratch on it, and it gets dirty, and it gets rusty, and you get frustrated, and you're just watching it melt away. You're watching the depreciation of it. You're thinking, what I wanted is just melting into the ground. Life is disappointing in many ways. The things that we pursue on this earth. So this is number one. One reason. Just this is not even the primary reason. But I will tell you that the pursuits you pursue on this earth, like if you had all that you wished you would have, it's almost like the taxes and upkeep on it alone. It's like ice cream in the sun. It just does not last. It's something that you want, but it is, you will learn that this earth is frustrating. Solomon says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity and striving after the wind. Like, it's just not going to satisfy in the end. You may think it will, but things are not what satisfies. So, and that's one reason, just one, but he says, set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on the earth. And there's a lot more reason, but I want to look at, I always love the Sermon on the Mount. I don't think I'll ever get over this Sermon on the Mount. One of these days, I'm just going to go back and cover it again, because I love it. But Jesus says in Matthew 6:19, he says, lay not up treasure on earth where moth and rust corrupt. And he says, and thieves break in and steal. And can you imagine, over 2,000 years ago, they're still complaining about the rust getting to their things. You know, they're like, just bought this chariot at Midwest Chariots or whatever they bought. Things rusting out already, you know? Not a lot changes, right? He's like, it just things, our stuff rusts out. They go bad. You spend this money on it, and it goes bad. He's like, don't live for these things. And he says, lay up for yourself treasure in heaven where neither moth nor rust corrupt, nor do thieves break in and steal. And then he says, and this is the most important part, because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And this is more important than, way more important than the fact that it's not really that satisfying in the end. The fact that no matter what you buy, it's a lot of work and it keeps going bad and it's just this punch in the face frustration. The way more important than that is if you're living for the things in heaven, your heart's going to be in heaven. You're going to love those things. It's like, are you living for this earth or are you living for heaven? Because if you're living for heaven, it's good because you're living for God, right? There's way more benefit in the fact that you're following Christ, you're living for Christ, and your life is with Christ. You're living for, it's like not for the things of this earth, but the fact that you're living for Christ means that you're in a good place spiritually in your life, that things are so good and well in your life that your heart is in the things that are right. And so, I think, in even like in possessions and things, that where your treasure is, how do you get your treasure in heaven, And I think there's several things. Right away we'd think of money, but there's also time and there's energy. There's a million different ways that you can make sure that you're living for God. And I know, I try, if you know me, I try very hard not to be the person who says, give your money to the church, and I get frustrated beyond end, and maybe this is just a pet peeve because it's not necessarily wrong, but when a preacher preaches and then he's like, and pass that plate around and give the money, and you're just like, wait, like, that's not our focus, that's not what we're after. But I will tell you, I do try, and I don't say this because of myself, but just because it's not a command, but it's a good goal. We try to give 10% of all that we get and all of our increase to God and the church and things, and then look for other things that are for the building fund or for other things that we can, or people in need, things that like are financially, we always want to know that we're putting things ahead, that we're putting it up where it won't go bad, where when the things crash, when the economy tanks, when things go sour, you're like, I'm glad I at least put something ahead, right? If you're older, you're probably glad you have a pension of some sort, right? You're hoping that you are putting things ahead, and not that I want to be anybody who ever focuses on it, but for your own sake and your own good, don't you want to live for those things? And then on top of that, it's your time and your energy. Like, what are you living for? And if you want to know what is like worthwhile. If you have lived for a friend or a neighbor and they started coming to church and following God, and you're seeing that they're going to be in eternity, I'm telling you, that doesn't lose its joy like a house or a car or anything like that. Like, this is like this joy that is like forever. Like, this was the best thing I've ever worked at. It's a lasting joy. It's something that goes on and on because you've invested in something that's worthwhile, and you're going to be happy about that. Not that that's even the reason, But I'm telling you, it is so much better to put your energy into these things that are going to last, and that your heart would be there. So continuing in Colossians 3, verse 4, he says this. He says, when Christ, who is your light, appears, he says, then you will appear with him in glory. And I think this is something that we just can't even think about. Like, do you realize that Christ will appear? He who is your life, hopefully he's your life. Some of us, he's not our life. And we're going to think, oh boy, he should have been my life. We're going to think, what was I living for? Why wasn't I living for Christ? What was I thinking, right? And when he who is your life, like he's the one who created you, who gave you life, who redeemed you from death a second time, who bought you, and he's going to appear, and you're going to be like, there he is. It's a moment that we just can't even hardly grasp, right? But if you believe that, like I would ask myself, why wouldn't you live for that moment, right? Why wouldn't you? And the only reason I can think is maybe your faith is not what it ought to be. If your faith is what it should be, you should be like, yeah, that moment will happen. He will appear. And I will think, I wish I would have lived more for him. I wish I would have put my life more in focus for the heavenly things, not the earthly things. You're going to think, what on earth was I thinking? I should have lived more for him, because he will appear, and we're going to see him there, and it's going to be a reality. And he says in verse 5, he says, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. And he says, and he lists these things that are competition for living for God. And he says this, he says sexual immorality, he says impurity, he says passions, he says evil desires and covetousness, which is idolatry. So these are all things that compete with God. You're like, why wouldn't I live for God? What's going to stop me from living for God? What is like holding me back? What are the things that would pull me away? Why wouldn't I just live for God? But things like sexual immorality, these are like a force within humanity that is like the old self that we're trying to put to death, but it's a real thing that is like pulling against us. It's like, man, that pulls on me. That's what my old self would want to do, and it's going to be a battle to put those things to death. And then he says impurity, which is, there's a lot of garbage in the world. There is tons of garbage in the world, and it can pull on you. It can pull you to the things that you really shouldn't be any part of. And it's a battle of which am I going to live for? Am I going to live for God, or am I going to live for the things of this world? And then he says passions, which it could be impure passions, or it could be just any passion. It could be the things that you just think you want. It could be all of those trinkets or the things of this world that you're like, man, I would really like to have that. And if I had that, everybody would think I was so cool because I have that thing, and I want that thing, and it's for my glory, it's for my pleasure, it's for my passion that I really want. And it's competing against God. It's competing who are you going to serve and what are you going to live for? He says evil desire. And again, these things kind of flow together. It's what do you want? And these are things that pull you away from God. And then he says this, and covetousness, which is idolatry, which means that it's something that you want that is not what God would have for you. It means you want the things of the old self that you should have put to death. You really want, maybe you're not even living for these things, but any of these list of things, and you want it. And he says that to you is an idol, because God is over here saying, no, follow me. Don't love all of those things. Don't love all the things. And you're thinking like, I love those things. Like I would really wish. And your heart is just pulling that way. And you think of Israel and the nation of Israel. If you're at all familiar with the Old Testament, you know that God had this nation of Israel who, in my mind, probably their greatest purpose was to show what the church would be one day. And they're going through these things that show who Christ would be, and they're showing all of these examples. And so they get into trouble, they get in problems, typical, all the time. And so they get in bondage, they get in slavery, and God removes them, he pulls them out, and he's like, I'm giving you a fresh start. And they're like, yes, and they make idols, and they begin to worship them, and you're like, idiots, they're so dumb. I believe they're a picture of us. Jesus Christ, through the blood of the cross, redeems us and takes us out. And when he says, when we want those things, it is idolatry. It means that we're looking at them. Those are idols. That is what I believe the Old Testament represented for us, the church. That we're like, we are literally setting up things nobody would say. If you ask people, oh, what is an idol for you? People are not ever going to say, oh, I love my car more than God. Nobody's ever going to say, oh, I said a little prayer to my boat this morning. Nobody's ever going to say those things. It's just a question of whether or not you're in love with the world. It's a question of whether or not you're like, I could live for God, but I don't have time because I am so pulled away by all the desires of this world that just take me away, and it just happens. And in effect, he says literally just the covetousness, the greed for everything that satisfies our old nature. He says that is our idol. And we would think, man, what fools we are for worshiping or setting up an idol that would be against the things of God. And why would we pull that way? It's because those things naturally pull on our old person that we would be. And then he says this in verse 6. He says, on account of these things, the wrath of God is coming. And when you think of these things, whether it be lust or greed or obsession over things, and you think of Israel and you're like, Israel, oh, those fools, like God brings them out of slavery and he gives them a fresh start and they set up an idol, those idiots, no wonder the wrath of God is coming on them. Wrath of God should come on them, right? But then we should think to ourselves, God who has set us free, who has redeemed us through the cross, who has given us a fresh start, and he says, I've raised you and I've given you the clean start, and then we set up idolatry, but through the greed and the lust that we have in our lives for the things that are not the things of God, for the things that are the things of the earth, and they're not the things of heaven, and we have those as our idols. Paul says, the wrath of God is coming for those. And, you think of these things and you really just shouldn't think, oh, just focus on the grace of God. You should think, am I the person who is set free and then just turned directly into idolatry, who just loves all of the things of this world? Is that me? Should I be thinking that the judgment of God is coming because it just didn't play out like it should have? When God sets you free, he should be your God, right? He should be your God, and him alone should be your God, right? You shouldn't be thinking to yourself, oh, he set me free to live the way I would have lived before. No, he says you put that to death. And then he says in verse 8, he says this. He says, but now you must put away. And he says, you've got to put these things away. He says, you must. He says, and then he says, and here's some other things. He says, anger, wrath, malice. He says, slander and obscene talk from your mouth. He says, you've got to put these things away. And if you've, hopefully, I don't really care whether you have, but a lot of us have seen the old movie Bambi, right? And if you remember, maybe you don't remember, but Bambi gets shot and wounded, and he's laying there, and the hunters are coming, the dogs are coming, and his dad comes along. He's like, get up, Bambi, you must get up. He's like, you gotta go, they're coming. He's like, you've got to, get up, go, you'll die. He's like, go. And I think this is what Paul is saying when he says this. He's like, you must put that to death. You must live for heaven. You've got to. You have absolutely got to. He says, don't think maybe. He says, the wrath of God is coming. Like the anger of God is coming because he set you free and you were living in idolatry. He's like, you've got to live for heaven. You must put these things away. You have to. And, as he's saying these things, he says, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk. And I think, as we think of these things, it's a matter of how we live after the graciousness of God. I had an incident this week where one of my kids got in trouble. They just weren't behaving as they should. And I got the call. I'm in my office, come home, deal with it. So I come home and I have this talk with them. And as I'm finishing this talk, they're like, what's for lunch? I'm like, no. When you get in trouble, you have an attitude of sorry, of change of heart, right? You don't flip to what's for lunch. You have a continued change. And you think of, us who have been forgiven. This is like the story of being forgiven the 10,000 talents, right? And God says, and not that hopefully you know that story, but Jesus tells tells a story of somebody who's been forgiven much, and it should have altered their attitude, right? They shouldn't have had anger and hatred towards other people. They should have been like, woe is me, I've been forgiven, I've had a change of attitude, and the first thing out of my mouth is not going to be what's for lunch, or what can I buy, or what can I get for myself, or what can I pursue. That's not the first thing out of your mouth when you've been redeemed by God. That's not how that's supposed to work. And so when he says anger, wrath, malice, slander, these are things of the heart of somebody who does not realize they were just forgiven. These are things of hatred. These are things of back talk and backstabbing of your fellow brother, that you're just like, you have hatred and anger, and you're kind of exploding at people as if it's all about you and you're all about this world, and you're self-defensive about yourself. And this is not the attitude of somebody who's putting their focus on God. These things have got to go. And then he says this, an obscene talk from your mouth. And I think this, quite a few years back, I heard this, and it really jumped out at me, because I wasn't really in the mindset of things. Sometimes we think to ourselves, oh, there's this gray area. It's not really wrong because the Bible doesn't even address it. I don't even know if the Bible, knows about, the crudeness of this world and this nature and certain things. And then I'm like, wow, he says right here, nothing ought to come out of your mouth that's obscene, and in the Greek that is vile, or nothing that is not clean before God. You're God's child. Nothing should come out of your mouth that has any appropriate nature. I don't care if it's funny or laughing along with it or anything of the sort. He says that has got to stop. That's not the attitude of somebody who's been forgiven. That is the old nature that needs to be put to death and needs to be put away. There shouldn't be anything that comes out of your mouth that isn't pure before God. He says that must stop. It must be ended because of these things, that God's wrath is coming because of people who do and practice these things. And then he says in verse 9, he says, and do not lie to one another. He says, seeing that you have put off the old self with his practices. He's like, I am living under the assumption that if you are a Christian, you did this. You were like, I've put it to death, and I've changed my ways. I don't do it anymore. He's living under the assumption that that's what we have done. So in closing this morning, it is supposed to be a definite in Christianity that you've changed your pursuits. It's supposed to be a given, a slam dunk, that you're not living for the old things that all of that desire within you would want to live for. It's supposed to be like, he's like, you used to live for those things, but you don't anymore. No, because you're a Christian. Obviously, repentance would have carried that idea of change with you. And he says this lastly, he says, put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. So, as we're closing this morning, I think there's two things that go with this. He's talking about a steady growing towards God, and then he's talking about, I believe, slamming on the brakes. And I think when you're talking about put it to death, when you're talking about stop living for this world, I think that's slam on the brakes. And I've heard people say, oh, I'm living in all of these things that I really shouldn't, and it's not good, but it's a process. I'm growing. I would say no. I don't think you're following Christ at all. And that's a cold opinion, but that's the opinion I've gotten from the Bible over many, many years of reading it. And I would say, when you follow Christ in repentance, as John says, he says, bring forth fruit worthy of repentance if you want me to baptize you. He says you need to bring forth a lifestyle that shows that you've changed. Now, even if you slam the brakes and you're like, I'm going to stop living for the world and stop following my flesh, and I'm going to start living for God, there's still a long ways to go after that. You still have so many problems to work on. I don't care how hard you try, but at least there's a solid effort that has begun, right? And from there, you grow. From there, you realize, wow, I could do better in this area, and wow, I'm still failing in that area, and wow, but there is, I think, first you slam the brakes and you say, it's time to live for God, and you make a major change in your life. And after that, you make continual growth, but you are fighting to do what is right every day, to follow God. He says, put to death these things, because on account of them, God's wrath is coming down. And I think, so as we look at our lives, let's just make sure that we're living for heaven, that we're living for eternity, that we're like, that's where my life is. When Christ appears, I'm gonna be like, I'm glad I lived for eternity. Because that's what faith is. Faith is living for the things unseen, right? You're living for the things of God. You're putting those as a value in your life. You're valuing things that God would value. You're making sure and prioritizing all of the right things because you care and you believe and you're going to follow after God. So let's just make sure we're doing that in our lives and not giving in to any other desires that would pull us away from following God. It is supposed to be a necessity that we do follow after God in our lives. So let's just go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, we just thank you for your word, and we thank you that you do warn us. We thank you that you tell us how we ought to live and what we ought to live for. That you tell us who we ought to be, that we are supposed to be this new creation. We're supposed to be these people who have really died to all of the pursuits of this world, and we're living for heaven. Lord, it's a much better choice, and maybe the reason that we fail to do that so often is a lack of faith, that we have that we're just not appreciative, or we're not trusting in you. We're not living knowing that is best. We're not following you as our Father, as our Lord. But I just ask that you just help us to prioritize you with our lives, and help us to live for eternity, and help us to live for heaven, and help us to just to slam the brakes on the pursuits of this earth and the idolatry of coveting all of the things that have nothing to do with you, God, and just help us to get our focus straight and right, Lord. And I just pray this in your Son's name. Amen.